This is Rory Joyce from Brunel Planning. I'm here with Sir Terry Farrell, CBE, who has just delivered a paper to the Joint Planning Law Conference in Oxford about city making. The title was City Making Many Hands Over Time. Terry, welcome. In your paper you spoke about cities being self-ordered and the emergence of cities as opposed to being planned. Can you just tell us how you think the current planning system, which is very much top-down, where's that failing in its appreciation of what its contribution is to the emergence of cities?
I think there are general failures in that architects and planners think they make too much difference. They think their plans are going to last for all time, and they actually affect 5% of our built environment at the most, and the reality is they will change over time. And I'm doing a lot of master planning, which is taking 20-25 years to build out, and all during that time that it's building out, markets change, demand changes, and it evolves even during master plan times. So I think that to have a policy that's based on big plans only and not flexible is mistaken. The other thing is that development control is particularly strong in this country. And I think development control, again, affects so little of what is built and what we do in our built environment. There is so much that pre-exists. There is so much that the roads and the places and the high streets and the market about who occupies which shop and so on, they will change, and they are beyond control. And in the end, all the development control is fiddle at the edges.
Can we just talk about that fiddling at the edges? That's in your paper, there were a lot of interesting points made which people asked questions about. And in particular, part of it was as we address the need for greater density in cities going forwards. And you mentioned that you thought high density mid-rise was really the way to go. But one of the things which we need to review, you were suggesting, was our rules for daylight and the regulations there. Why is that?
I think that developers, development control officers, tend to lose sight of the fact that these rules are advisory. And because they're taking shortcuts, because the penalty of going to appeal and arguing with development control is so strong, they are very seldom challenged and so on. But there's no doubt that we couldn't build our conservation areas today. We couldn't build most of the centres of our cities today, whether Paris, New York, whatever, under present advisory rules and regulations, simply because it assumes that daylight trumps everything in its own field, and it dictates layouts and it produces the kind of environments that we all see around us as evolving today.
Now, you've built some rather tall buildings, and indeed I think it's the tallest building in the world by a British architect. When you look at the heights of buildings, what you don't just build a building, and you're proud of the fact that you're actually building a community, a vertical community, and that goes forward. When you've done that, and indeed some of the buildings we're talking about, they're not in the UK. What is it you think we ought to do within the UK in terms of enabling us to increase density, put into place? What would you change? You had your Farrell review, it's where you put forward various recommendations. What are the biggest changes you'd like to see in how we go about in terms of education and how we look at our planners and architects now?
I think there's a great hunger for environmental knowledge and about history of the place and the culture of place. And I would say that all cities and towns and villages should have an urban room. And there should be a civic initiative, by which I mean firms, institutions, Town Planning Institute, RICS and others, and our university colleges of education and the practices. They should all contribute to schools and education and changing the culture, because it can't be done through educational processes that we have now. It has to be recognised that kids today in school rate environment, they're hungry for information, and adults are too, but they don't know how to influence things. They can't, they are not presented in the round with propositions. I often quote, right where I'm building an urban room in Newcastle, the fact that there was an enormous debate about one building and the whole place was changed around it, and without any discussion by road engineers and what have you.
So tell us about an urban room. What would it look like?
I think it's virtual or it's physical, or preferably both. So it's online and as well as a place to go to. And to see the models representing your town, village, city, or a part of it. It could be a university campus, it could be a hospital, it could be an institutional owned land in that way. But it's important to see the history and to read and to have the best possible representation of the history, and to see new proposals, and so that you can add them up and look at it. And I think the aim is increased environmental awareness of the physical fabric of our cities and places.
So, Terry, you were talking about ecology and diversity, biodiversity, and the importance of that to your work. Indeed, it runs through everything you do. You mentioned that you thought development creates richness and diversity, and it's one of the best ways in which we can do it within cities. And you were referring to gardens. What did you mean by that?
I think that it's a fact that the richest ecological part of Britain is invariably the cities and the city gardens and parks. And those areas contribute more ecological richness and diversity than any farming land or defended landscape through national parks and so on. But the reality is that they wouldn't happen without development. The gardens and the parks are there because of urbanity and development. And I see increasingly development adding to, if you look at King's Cross or the banks of the Thames or Canary Wharf and the Docklands in London, or Newcastle Quayside, or areas of Birmingham and Manchester. It's development that makes the canals accessible, that makes the opportunity to plant trees, and this richness of landscaping and accessibility is through development and change. And therefore the conclusion that it's concreting over our cities is wrong.
So Terry Farrell, thank you very much.